Every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., the crying would start, and no one at the shelter could explain why. The sound wasn't loud at first, just a soft, broken whimper echoing through the quiet halls. But night after night it grew harder to ignore, crawling under the skin of anyone who heard it, making sleep impossible and leaving behind a strange, lingering unease that no one could shake. The staff at Greenridge Animal Shelter had seen grieving pets before, dogs that refused to eat, cats that hid for days, but this was different. Charlie, a small gray tabby with dull, tired eyes, had arrived just 3 days earlier after his owner, Margaret Wilson, passed away unexpectedly in her home, and from the moment he was placed into his kennel, something about him felt off. He didn't explore, didn't react to the other animals, didn't even respond when his name was called. Instead, he curled himself tightly into the corner, his frail body wrapped around a worn leather collar as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the world, and then he started crying. Not the typical meow of a lonely cat, not the restless scratching or pacing that came with anxiety, but a low, aching sound that rose and fell like he was trying to say something no one could understand. The first night, the staff assumed it was grief, the natural reaction of a pet who had lost the only person he'd ever known, and they tried to comfort him with soft voices, gentle hands, even leaving a small blanket that still carried a faint human scent beside him, but nothing worked. The second night, the crying returned, this time sharper, more urgent, and always at the exact same time, as if triggered by something unseen, something internal, something precise. By the third night, even the most experienced staff members began to exchange uneasy glances, whispering quietly in the break room, trying to come up with explanations that made sense, but none of them could ignore the pattern. At 2:17 a.m., like clockwork, Charlie would lift his head, his eyes wide and fixed on the empty hallway beyond his kennel, and begin that same haunting cry, his paws tightening around the collar as though protecting it from something or someone. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It felt intentional, deliberate, almost like a warning. One volunteer, a college student named Lisa, swore she saw him staring at the shelter door as if he was waiting for someone to walk in, while another claimed that when she tried to gently remove the collar to clean it, Charlie reacted with sudden panic, hissing and pulling away in a way that didn't match his otherwise weak and exhausted state. That was the moment the unease shifted into something heavier, something harder to dismiss. Because grieving animals didn't guard objects like that. They didn't react with fear to something so small, so ordinary, unless it wasn't ordinary at all. And yet, no one wanted to jump to conclusions. It was just a collar, old and slightly scratched, the kind you'd find on any pet, worn from years of use. Nothing remarkable at a glance. But still, every night, at the same exact minute, Charlie cried, and every time someone stepped closer, he tightened his grip on that collar like it held the answer to something no one else could see. By the fourth night, the shelter director made a quiet decision to call in a veterinarian to take a closer look. Not because Charlie was physically ill, but because something about this didn't feel right. And as the clock ticked closer to 2:17 a.m. once again, no one in the building could shake the feeling that whatever was about to happen next was going to change everything. Dr. Ethan Cole arrived just before midnight, his truck headlights cutting through the still darkness as he pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, the soft hum of the engine fading as he stepped out and glanced at the quiet building ahead, already sensing the unusual tension that had been described to him over the phone. He had worked with animals for over 15 years, seen countless cases of grief and behavioral distress, and yet the urgency in the shelter director's voice had been enough to bring him in at an hour when most clinics were long closed. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale glow across the rows of kennels, and as soon as he walked in, he noticed it immediately. The silence felt heavier than it should have been, like everyone was waiting for something. The director, Karen Mitchell, approached him quickly, her expression tight with concern as she lowered her voice and explained what had been happening, how the crying started at the exact same time every night, how the cat refused to eat properly, and most importantly, how he would not let anyone near his collar. Ethan listened carefully, nodding slightly, but his eyes had already found Charlie across the room. The small tabby was curled tightly in the corner of his enclosure, his body almost motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his breathing, and even from a distance, Ethan could see the way his paws were wrapped protectively around that worn collar. There was something about the posture that did not feel like simple attachment. It looked more like guarding. Ethan stepped closer, moving slowly, keeping his voice calm and steady as he crouched down near the kennel, speaking softly to the cat, introducing himself even though he knew the animal could not understand the words. Charlie did not react at first, his eyes half closed, distant. But as Ethan's hand moved closer to the latch, the cat's body tensed almost instantly, his grip tightening around the collar, his eyes snapping open with a sharp, focused awareness that had not been there seconds before. It was not aggression, not quite fear either, but something in between, something controlled, as if he was making a decision in that moment. Ethan paused, studying him more carefully now, noting the subtle tremor in his muscles, the way his gaze flicked briefly toward the hallway and then back to the collar, as though tracking something unseen. Behind him, Karen whispered that it would happen soon, that they were only minutes away from the time, and Ethan checked his watch without thinking, the digital display reading 2:15 a.m. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, the quiet stretching out until even the smallest sounds felt amplified, a distant ventilation fan, the faint shuffle of someone shifting their weight, and then, without warning, Charlie lifted his head. The movement was slow, deliberate, his ears angling forward, his entire focus locking onto the empty hallway beyond the kennels, and for a brief moment, there was complete stillness, the kind that made everyone hold their breath without realizing it. Then it started, the same low, aching cry, rising from deep within him, steady and rhythmic. But this time Ethan was close enough to hear the subtle difference. The way the sound carried something more than grief, something urgent, almost pleading. It was not random. It was not confusion. It felt directed. Ethan's eyes shifted back to the collar, and now, under the harsh light, he could see the faint scratches along its surface, small marks that looked intentional rather than worn, as if something had been altered or hidden. He leaned in slightly, careful not to startle the cat, his mind beginning to connect pieces that did not quite fit yet, and as Charlie's cry continued, unwavering, Ethan realized one thing with absolute certainty. This was not just a grieving animal. This was an animal trying to communicate something, and whatever it was tied to that collar in a way none of them had yet understood. The crying did not stop, not even for a second, and as the minutes passed, it became impossible to ignore the pattern that was forming right in front of them. Dr. Ethan Cole remained crouched beside the kennel, his eyes fixed on Charlie, but his mind was already working through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Most animals in distress showed signs of unpredictability, irregular behavior driven by emotion, but this was precise, controlled, almost calculated. Every movement Charlie made seemed deliberate, from the way he held the collar to the exact direction of his gaze, always toward that same empty stretch of hallway, as if something existed there that only he could perceive. Ethan slowly shifted his position, careful not to startle the cat, and followed the line of Charlie's sight, scanning the hallway for anything unusual, any reflection, any shadow, any small detail that might explain why the animal kept focusing on that exact spot. But there was nothing, just a closed door at the far end, a faint exit sign glowing red. Above it, and the stillness of a building that should have been asleep. Behind him, Karen and the others watched in silence, their earlier skepticism replaced with something closer to concern, because the longer this continued, the harder it became to dismiss it as simple grief. Ethan leaned slightly closer again, lowering his voice as he spoke, not expecting an answer, but hoping to create a sense of calm. And for a brief moment, Charlie's crying softened, his eyes flickering toward Ethan before snapping back to the hallway, his body tensing once more. That was when Ethan noticed something new. The collar was not just scratched, it had been tampered with. The marks were too concentrated, too intentional, clustered around the small metal tag attached to the front, as if someone or something had tried to remove or obscure what was written there. Ethan's focus sharpened immediately, his instincts shifting from observation to investigation, and he carefully extended his hand again, slower this time, inching closer to the collar without breaking eye contact with the cat. Charlie reacted instantly, pulling the collar closer to his chest, his breathing quickening. But this time he did not lash out or retreat. Instead, he held his ground, his eyes locking onto Ethan's with a strange intensity that felt almost expectant. It was not the reaction of an animal protecting something out of fear. It felt like he was waiting for something to happen, like he knew that moment was important. Ethan paused, reading the tension in the cat's body, and then, very gently, he spoke again, his tone softer than before, steady and reassuring. For a second, nothing changed. The crying continued, the same haunting rhythm filling the room, and then, slowly, almost reluctantly, Charlie loosened his grip just enough for the edge of the tag to become visible under the harsh overhead light. Ethan leaned in closer, squinting slightly, trying to make out the engraving, but the scratches made it difficult to read, the surface worn down as if someone had tried to erase it. He could see letters, faint and uneven, not matching the clean engraving typically found on pet tags, and something about that detail sent a quiet chill through him. Because collars were meant to identify, to connect an animal to its owner, to provide clarity, this one seemed to do the opposite. It hit something. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small penlight, clicking it on and angling the beam carefully toward the tag, illuminating the surface just enough to catch the shallow grooves beneath the scratches. The room felt impossibly still again, every pair of eyes fixed on that tiny piece of metal as if it held the answer to everything they had witnessed. Charlie's crying softened into a low, trembling sound, his body tense but unmoving, and for the first time since Ethan had arrived, it felt like the moment they had been building toward was finally within reach. Whatever was on that collar had been hidden for a reason, and now, as the light revealed more of the worn surface, Ethan realized that this was no longer just about understanding a grieving animal. This was about uncovering something that someone had tried very hard to keep from being found. The beam of the penlight hovered over the scratched metal tag, trembling slightly in Dr. Ethan Cole's hand, not because he was unsure, but because something about the moment felt heavier than it should have been, like he was standing at the edge of a truth that did not want to be uncovered. Charlie remained perfectly still now, his earlier crying reduced to a faint, uneven sound, his eyes fixed on the tag as if he understood exactly what Ethan was about to see. The scratches were deeper up close, not random where from time or friction, but deliberate marks, layered over the original engraving in a way that made the surface uneven, distorted. Someone had tried to hide whatever was written there, not remove it entirely, but make it unreadable at a glance. Ethan adjusted the angle of the light, narrowing his focus, letting the beam catch the shallow grooves beneath the damage, and slowly, piece by piece, the letters began to take shape. At first, it did not make sense. The name etched into the tag did not match what they had been told. It was not Margaret Wilson. Ethan blinked, thinking perhaps he was misreading the worn lines. But as he shifted the light again, the letters became clearer, more defined, forming a name that none of them recognized. A quiet murmur spread behind him as Karen leaned in slightly, trying to see, but Ethan did not respond. His attention was locked on the tag, on the way the original engraving seemed older than the scratches, as if it had existed long before someone decided to alter it. That detail alone was enough to unsettle him, because collars were not usually replaced without reason, and they certainly were not modified like this unless someone had something to hide. Charlie let out another soft cry, lower this time, almost like a signal, and Ethan glanced up briefly, meeting the cat's gaze. There was something there, something steady and aware, something that made it impossible to believe this was coincidence. Ethan reached a decision then, moving slowly but with purpose, and gently slid the latch open. The metallic click echoed softly in the room, and for a split second, no one moved. Then, carefully, he reached inside, keeping his movements deliberate, his voice calm as he spoke again, more for himself than for the animal. Charlie tensed immediately, his body tightening, his paws instinctively pulling the collar closer, but he did not retreat. He did not resist the way Ethan expected. Instead, he held still, his breathing shallow, his eyes fixed on Ethan's hands as if he was allowing it, as if this was the moment he had been waiting for all along. That realization sent a quiet chill through Ethan, but he did not stop. With careful precision, he loosened the collar just enough to lift the tag fully into the light, turning it slightly to catch every angle, every hidden mark. The room seemed to shrink around them, the silence pressing in as everyone waited, and then Ethan saw it. Beneath the scratches, beneath the attempts to obscure it, there was more than just a name. There was a second line, faint but unmistakable, etched deeper than the rest, as if it had been meant to last. Ethan's breath caught for just a moment as he read the words silently, his expression shifting in a way he could not control, and behind him, Karen whispered his name, her voice tight with anticipation. Ethan did not answer right away. His mind was racing now, connecting pieces that had not made sense before, the timing of the crying, the way Charlie guarded the collar, the unnatural precision of his behavior. This was not just identification. This was a message, and someone had tried to make sure no one would ever read it. Ethan finally exhaled slowly, his voice quieter than before, almost disbelieving as he spoke the words out loud. And in that moment, the entire room seemed to change, because whatever had been hidden on that collar was no longer a mystery. It was something far more unsettling, something that raised more questions than it answered, and as Charlie let out one final, trembling cry, it became clear to everyone listening that this story was not about a grieving pet at all. It was about something that had been left behind, something that refused to stay buried, and somehow, this small, quiet animal had been carrying it all along. The words settled into the room with a weight that no one was prepared for, and for a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not understand, but because they were trying to. Dr. Ethan Cole kept his eyes on the tag, reading it again silently, as if the meaning might change the second time, but it did not. The name engraved there was not Margaret Wilson. It was someone else entirely. And beneath it, the second line, clearer now under the light, read a short message that made even less sense at first glance, a phrase that felt incomplete on its own but carried an undeniable urgency. Karen stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked what it said, and Ethan hesitated before answering, not out of uncertainty, but because he knew that once the words were spoken, everything about this situation would shift. Slowly, carefully, he read it aloud. The reaction was immediate. Confusion, disbelief, and a growing sense of unease spread across the faces of everyone in the room, because the message did not fit the story they had been told. It did not align with the idea of a simple pet grieving its owner. It suggested something else, something hidden, something unresolved. Charlie's soft crying continued, but it had changed again, no longer sharp or desperate, now almost rhythmic, as if it had been guiding them to this exact moment. Ethan lowered the tag slightly, his mind racing as he began to piece things together. If the collar did not belong to Margaret Wilson, then where had it come from? And more importantly, why had someone tried to scratch out the original information? Karen quickly moved to the office, pulling up the intake records on the computer, scrolling through the details that had been provided when Charlie was brought in. According to the paperwork, Margaret's neighbor had found the cat alone in the house after her passing and brought him directly to the shelter. There had been no mention of another owner, no indication that the cat had belonged to anyone else before her. Everything had seemed straightforward. Until now. Ethan glanced back at Charlie, who had gone completely still, his eyes no longer fixed on the hallway but on the tag itself, as if the moment they had uncovered the message, his focus had shifted. That alone was enough to confirm what Ethan was beginning to suspect. This was not random behavior. This had a purpose. Karen returned with the file, her expression tense as she scanned through it again, looking for anything they might have missed, but there was nothing unusual on the surface. No previous records, no additional notes, just the basic information of a single owner and a single pet. It was too clean, too simple. Ethan stood slowly, still holding the tag in his hand, and looked around the room, his voice steady but firm as he spoke. They needed more information. The name on the collar had to mean something, and the message beneath it was not something someone would engrave without reason. It pointed somewhere, hinted at something beyond the shelter walls. Karen nodded immediately, already reaching for her phone, suggesting they contact the neighbor who had brought Charlie in. If there was anything they did not know about Margaret, about her life, about where she had gotten the cat, it might come out now. As she stepped away to make the call, Ethan turned back to Charlie, carefully lowering the collar back around his neck. The moment the tag touched his fur, the cat let out a soft, trembling sound, not quite a cry this time, but something closer to relief. It was subtle, but unmistakable. And then, For the first time since any of them had met him, Charlie stopped crying completely. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the noise had been, because it confirmed something none of them could ignore anymore. Whatever message had been hidden on that collar, whatever truth it pointed to, Charlie had been waiting for someone to find it. And now that they had, there was no turning back. Karen stepped back into the room, her phone still in her hand, her expression no longer just tense but visibly shaken. And the moment Ethan saw her face, he knew the situation had just taken another turn. She did not speak right away, as if she was still processing what she had just been told, and that silence alone was enough to draw everyone's attention. Finally, she exhaled slowly and said the neighbor had confirmed something they had not expected. Margaret Wilson had only had Charlie for a short time, less than a year. The cat had not been hers originally. That single detail shifted everything. Ethan felt it immediately, the pieces rearranging in his mind, forming a pattern that was starting to make sense in a way that was both clear and deeply unsettling. If Margaret was not the original owner, then the name on the collar might not be a mistake at all. It might be the truth. Karen continued, explaining that the neighbor remembered Margaret mentioning she had taken the cat in after finding him wandering near an old property on the edge of town, a place that had been vacant for years. No one had thought much of it at the time. It had sounded like a simple rescue, an act of kindness. But now, with the hidden engraving and the strange message, it felt like something else entirely. Ethan looked back at Charlie, who remained still, his breathing calm now, his eyes no longer searching the hallway but watching them, as if he was following every word, every realization. That calmness was the most striking change of all. The urgency was gone, replaced by a quiet stillness that felt almost intentional, as if the message had been delivered. Ethan's grip tightened slightly around the tag as he replayed the words in his mind, focusing on the second line, the part that had caused the strongest reaction. It was not just a name. It was a direction, a location, subtle, incomplete on its own, but clear enough to suggest a place tied to the original owner. Karen noticed the shift in his expression and asked what he was thinking, and Ethan did not hesitate this time. He explained that the message was not meant to identify the cat. It was meant to lead someone somewhere. That was why it had been hidden. That was why Charlie had guarded it so fiercely. The room fell silent again, but this time it was different. This was not confusion anymore. This was understanding beginning to take shape. One of the staff members quietly asked if they should contact the authorities, and Karen nodded slowly, already considering it, but Ethan raised a hand gently, his voice calm but firm. Not yet. They needed to be certain. They needed to verify what the message meant before involving anyone else. Acting too quickly could complicate things, especially if this turned out to be something smaller than it appeared. But even as he said it, there was a part of him that knew it was not small. Nothing about this had been small from the beginning. Karen agreed, though reluctantly, and suggested they could at least check the property the neighbor had mentioned. It was only a few miles away, less than a 10-minute drive. Close enough to verify quickly, far enough to feel separate from everything they had assumed about Margaret's life. Ethan nodded, the decision settling between them without needing further discussion. He glanced down at Charlie one more time, watching for any reaction, any sign that they were on the right track. The cat blinked slowly, his body relaxed now, his paws no longer gripping the collar with the same intensity, and for the first time since Ethan had arrived, there was no tension in him at all. It was as if the responsibility had shifted, as if whatever Charlie had been trying to carry was no longer his alone. Ethan straightened up, turning toward the others as he spoke quietly, explaining that he and Karen would go check the location while the rest of the staff stayed behind. The plan was simple, but the weight behind it was anything but. As Karen reached for her keys and the two of them moved toward the door, the shelter remained silent, the earlier unease replaced by something deeper, something more focused. And as they stepped out into the cool night air, neither of them said it out loud, but they both understood the same thing. They were no longer trying to calm a grieving animal. They were following a trail that someone had gone to great lengths to hide, and somehow, that trail had led them straight to a small gray cat who refused to let it be forgotten. The drive felt longer than it should have, even though Karen had said it was less than 10 minutes. And as the shelter disappeared behind them, the quiet inside the car became almost suffocating, filled only by the low hum of the engine and the occasional glance they exchanged without speaking. The address from the collar had not been exact, but it had been enough to narrow it down to a small stretch of road on the outskirts of town where old properties sat scattered across wide patches of land, most of them abandoned or rarely visited. Ethan kept replaying the message in his mind, the way the words had been engraved with intention, not as identification but as direction, and the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that this had been planned. Someone had expected that message to be found eventually. The question was why it had been hidden in the first place. Karen slowed the car as they turned onto a narrow gravel road, the tires crunching softly beneath them, and ahead, barely visible under the faint glow of the headlights, stood a small, weathered house set back from the road by about 50 yards, its silhouette quiet and still against the night sky. There were no lights on, no signs of recent activity, but something about it immediately felt different from the other empty structures they had passed. It did not look forgotten. It looked paused, as if time had simply stopped there. Karen parked the car near the edge of the driveway, both of them sitting for a moment in silence before either reached for the door handle, as if acknowledging without words that stepping out would change everything. Ethan was the first to move, opening the door and stepping into the cool night air, the faint scent of dry grass and dust surrounding him as he looked toward the house. Karen followed, her footsteps quieter, more cautious, and together they walked slowly up the path, each step deliberate, their attention fixed on the front door. As they got closer, Ethan noticed something small but significant. The door was not fully closed. It was slightly ajar, just enough to reveal a thin line of darkness inside. He paused, exchanging a quick glance with Karen, and without speaking, he gently pushed the door open. The hinges creaked softly, the sound echoing faintly through the stillness, and as they stepped inside, the air felt different, heavier, carrying the faint scent of something old but not entirely abandoned. The room was dim, illuminated only by the light from outside, revealing furniture that was still in place, a couch, a small table, shelves with objects that had not been disturbed. It did not look like a place that had been cleared out. It looked like a place someone had left in a hurry or intended to return to. Karen whispered that this did not match what she expected from an abandoned property, and Ethan nodded slightly, his eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail, every small inconsistency. Then he saw it. On the far wall, just above a small desk, there was a framed photograph. Even from a distance, it stood out, not because it was unusual, but because it was the only thing in the room that felt personal. Ethan stepped closer, his movements slow, careful, and as he reached the desk, the image came into focus. It was a photograph of a man, standing beside a small gray cat that looked unmistakably like Charlie, only younger, healthier, and beside him, partially visible in the frame, was something else that made Ethan's breath catch for a moment. The name. The same name from the collar. It was written on a small plaque beneath the photo, clear and untouched, confirming what they had already begun to suspect. This was not Margaret's cat. And whatever connection existed between this place, this man, and that hidden message had been waiting here long before anyone at the shelter ever realized something was wrong. Karen stepped closer beside him, her voice barely audible as she asked if that was the same name, and Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the photograph, the weight of the realization settling in. Charlie had not just been grieving. He had been leading them here. And now that they had arrived, it was becoming clear that the story they thought they were uncovering was only just beginning. The discovery shifted the air inside the house, turning curiosity into something far more focused. And as Karen stood beside him staring at the photograph, Ethan felt a quiet certainty settle in that they were no longer following a vague clue, but standing inside the center of it. The man in the picture looked to be in his late 40s, his expression calm, almost reserved, and beside him the gray cat, unmistakably Charlie, sat with an alert posture that mirrored exactly what they had seen at the shelter, as if time had passed, but something essential had not changed. The name beneath the frame was clear, untouched, and it matched perfectly with what had been engraved on the collar before someone had tried to scratch it out. Karen let out a slow breath, her voice barely steady as she whispered that this had to be the original owner, the person Charlie had belonged to before Margaret ever found him, and Ethan nodded, his attention already moving beyond the photograph, scanning the rest of the room for anything that might explain why this connection had been hidden. On the desk beneath the frame, There were scattered papers, not disorganized, but not neatly arranged either, as if someone had been in the middle of something and then stopped. Ethan reached forward, picking up one of the documents, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily, and as he glanced over the page, he realized it was a utility bill addressed to the same name on the photograph, dated just over a year ago. That detail aligned too closely to be ignored. It suggested that whoever this man was, he had been here not long before Charlie ended up with Margaret. Karen moved closer, looking over his shoulder, and quietly asked the question that was already forming in both their minds. What had happened to him? Ethan did not answer right away, because the truth was they did not know yet, but everything about this place suggested that whatever had happened had not been fully resolved. He set the paper down gently and continued searching, his movements more deliberate now, until something else caught his attention, a small wooden box tucked against the side of the desk, partially hidden behind a stack of envelopes. It was not locked, just closed, and something about its placement made it feel intentional. Ethan hesitated for a brief moment before opening it, aware that each new discovery was pulling them deeper into something they still did not fully understand. Inside, there were only a few items, a set of old keys, a folded piece of paper, and a small tag identical in shape to the one Charlie had been wearing, but clean, untouched, with no scratches obscuring its surface. Ethan picked it up carefully, turning it under the dim light, and there it was again, the same name, clearly engraved, and beneath it, the same style of second line, but this time fully visible. Karen leaned in, her breath catching slightly as she read it out loud, her voice trembling not from fear, but from the realization of what it meant. It was not just a message. It was a set of instructions. Short, precise, and unmistakably deliberate. Ethan's mind raced as the connection became undeniable. The collar Charlie had been wearing was not damaged by accident. It had been altered to hide this exact information, and the version they were now holding was what it had originally looked like. Someone had replaced or modified it after the fact. Karen stepped back slightly, her eyes moving between the box, the photograph, and the door as if trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. But there were still gaps, too many unanswered questions. Why had Margaret never mentioned any of this? Why had the collar been changed? And most importantly, why had Charlie held on to it so desperately, refusing to let anyone near it until now? Ethan looked down at the clean tag one more time, then back at the room around them, and in that moment, everything aligned in a way that felt both clear and deeply unsettling. This was not just a forgotten house or a misplaced pet. This was a story that had been interrupted, something left unfinished, and Charlie had been the only one who remembered where it started. And now, standing in that quiet room, holding the piece that completed the message, Ethan understood that whatever came next was not about guessing anymore. It was about following through on what had been left behind. The instructions on the clean tag were simple, almost surprisingly so, and yet they carried a weight that neither Ethan nor Karen could ignore, because they pointed to something very specific, something intentional, something that had been planned with the expectation that one day someone would follow them. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the quiet of the house pressing in around them as the reality of what they had uncovered settled into place. And then Ethan folded the paper carefully and placed the tag back into the box, his movements steady, controlled, as if he already knew what needed to happen next. Karen glanced toward the door, then back at Ethan, her expression uncertain but resolute, and without needing to say it out loud, they both understood that they had come too far to stop now. Following the instructions did not feel like a choice anymore. It felt like a responsibility. The next location was not far, just a few minutes further down the same road, and as they stepped back outside into the cool night air, the stillness felt different now, no longer empty, but filled with quiet anticipation. The drive was shorter this time, and when they reached the second location, it was not a house, not a building at all, but a small, open clearing surrounded by tall trees, the kind of place that might go unnoticed unless someone knew exactly where to look. Karen slowed the car to a stop, and neither of them moved right away, both staring out at the dim outline of the clearing illuminated by the headlights, as if expecting something to reveal itself without them needing to step closer. Ethan was the first to open the door, his shoes crunching softly against the gravel as he walked forward, scanning the ground carefully, his attention drawn to the center of the clearing where the grass looked slightly different, more worn, as if it had been disturbed at some point in the past. Karen followed a few steps behind, her voice low as she asked what they were looking for, and Ethan did not answer immediately, because the truth was, he did not know exactly what they would find, only that whatever it was had been important enough to hide, important enough for someone to go to great lengths to ensure it would not be discovered easily. He moved closer to the center, crouching slightly as he examined the ground, and then he saw it. A small, weathered container, partially buried beneath the surface, just visible enough to be found if someone knew where to look. Ethan reached down carefully, brushing away the loose dirt, his movements slow and deliberate, and as he lifted it free, the weight of it in his hands confirmed what he already suspected. This was it. Karen stepped closer, her breath catching slightly as Ethan opened the container, and inside, there were only a few items, a folded letter, a photograph, and a small object that matched the set of keys they had found in the house. Ethan picked up the letter first, unfolding it carefully, and as his eyes moved across the page, his expression shifted, not to shock this time, but to something quieter, something deeper. He read it silently for a moment, then aloud, his voice steady but softened by the meaning behind the words. It was from the man in the photograph, written with the clear intention that someone would find it one day, explaining that he had been forced to leave unexpectedly, that he could not take everything with him, and that he had hidden what mattered most in a place only he and Charlie would remember. He had trusted the cat, trusted that somehow, if the time ever came, Charlie would lead someone back to the truth. Karen listened, her eyes fixed on the letter, her expression slowly shifting from confusion to understanding, and when Ethan finished reading, the silence that followed was no longer heavy or uncertain. It was calm, complete. The story that had been broken was now whole again. Ethan folded the letter carefully, placing it back into the container,